And so for me, how was I going to survive my marriage? How am I going to find that feeling of feeling wanted or feeling desired? And so for me, what that looked like was, well, I'm going to go flirt with other people, and I bet I could get somebody to have sex with me. But you have to realize, I think, that when you pass a point in your relationship where you're no longer being related, you're really surviving.
Take control of your life. Break the chains and rise. No more feeling powerless. No more shame. Take your power. Break out of the pain. Because it's more than fornication. More than procreation. It's not just self-stimulation. Sex energy is for creation and transformation into a new destination.
This is Porn Talk.
Porn Talk. Yeah. Change your heart from dark to light. Porn Talk. Yeah. Break free. Take back your power and rise. I said take back your power. I said take back your power. Take back your power and rise.
This is Porn Talk. Here is your host, Eric Zuzak.
Welcome to Porn Talk. This is Powerful Eric. This show is not just about breaking addictions. It's about breaking belief systems. We are bound by self-imposed and societal chains. Break those rusty, heavy old chains and get empowered right now. Today, we have the pleasure of hosting two extraordinary individuals who bring a wealth of knowledge and wisdom to the table. Joining us are Zack and Sierra, seasoned relationship coaches with over a decade of experience and an inspiring 20 plus years together. They host a podcast called Be Intact. They have dedicated their lives to empowering others to break free from barriers, embrace authenticity, and build meaningful connections. Throughout this episode, we'll delve into their experience on navigating relationships, overcoming challenges, and addressing sex addictions with grace and compassion. So get ready to be inspired and enlightened by this power couple as they share their candid advice and practical insights. Let's welcome Zack and Sierra. Welcome.
Awesome. Great introduction.
Thank you.
Very humbled. And that's right. I'm Zack.
feeling pumped up after the theme song and that.
I feel pretty good.
Thank you. I'm really proud of that music, by the way. So
it's amazing. Like, I got to download this song. This is phenomenal.
Thank you. So, Zack and Sierra, let's jump right in. What's your guys' story? How do you get into being relationship coaches, and what are some of the challenges that you guys have had?
Well, I always like to, it's the funnest story of all. It's not a lot of people have this story, but we love to open up with, well, we met at band camp.
True story.
True story. And that's always the reaction
like
we get.
Perfect for this podcast.
Yeah.
Oh boy.
So you can imagine, and we were young high school kids, I was like 16 years old, and she was like, 15. So about a year, we were one grade apart. And I first saw her on the marching field at band camp practicing. So I was wearing bleached frosted tips in my hair when I had it, and a puka shell necklace. And I was just a little butterfly running around.
Yeah, which is back in style.
In style.
And we were really great friends first, which I think served us pretty well. And then all of a sudden,
connection happened.
Yeah, it became more serious than that.
Yeah, I mean, to go through that really fast, we went through the high school sweetheart stage. I ended up dating one of her friends for just a few months. You know how high school relationships go. We would go out to double dates. I specifically remember maybe it was Red Robin or something like that, Applebee's. And we ended up, she had her boyfriend. I had my girlfriend, which was her friend. And it was like a cute little high school double date, very harmless. And then Sierra and I were end up just connecting the whole time. And I'm like, I just got to hang around this girl more often. And then you kind of fast forward, that friendship really fostered. And eventually we ended up, I guess, making a more of a commitment later on in high school.
And I think part of the challenges or how we kind of ended up as coaches later on was because we had to grow up together while also growing together. We kind of laugh that there are a lot of things. There was a lot of things in our adult lives that we were doing for the first time with each other.
Yes.
Those very basic things like paying bills, making sure that you fill your gas tank and those very basic things you do as an adult. We were learning how to do them and growing into adults and trying to grow up together. So there was a lot of challenges, or Zach moving faster than me or me moving faster than Zach, and just our growth into adulthood from being teenagers.
Yes. And when you look around, you only had others to compare it to. And so we often joke, like, you hear people when they get separated or divorced, or it could be any sort of major challenge, and you often hear, you're just not the same person as I married, or I don't know you anymore. And our response to that now is like, good.
Goodness, you're not the same 16-year-old crazy guy.
Yeah. So we're definitely no stranger to, and we can dive into this, but we've experienced it all. A lot of people think it's like this honeymoon state. Oh, how cute, high school sweethearts, been together for so long. You got a 10-year-old son and a 7-year-old daughter. Great. Well, yeah, if you don't want to talk about sex addiction, infidelity, alcohol abuse, sometimes verbal, and the occasional, when we were really young, but limited physical. And you have a myriad and just a nightmare of events that on paper would justify divorce multiple times over. I mean, I look back and I'm like, I would have been like, yeah, that makes sense. You're separating. It's often a miracle that we're still together.
So besides all those things, everything is just sunshine and rainbows.
That's right.
Besides those couple things, it's been a dream ride. And I think part of it too was out of our group of friends, we got married still in college. I had a semester left in college when we got married, and then we had kids first. And so we were the first in our community doing a lot of different things. And that also brought with it that comparison to this fantasy of what it should be like, because no one else was doing it. And so when things started to, quote unquote, go wrong, there was no talk about it. There was a lot of shame around it. It was very isolating because all we knew was this comparison to this fantasy that doesn't really exist, by the way.
We had no friends. We were also at that stage where we were ahead of a lot of our peers. Like when you get married, and when you get married that young, I remember, like, to your point, relying on a show, a TV, or a 50-year-old couple that is where I should be now if you're married. And because I couldn't talk to any of my friends about it.
No, so it seemed like couples who had been married for a while, it just kind of happened. And so when these things started to creep in, alcohol was a really big one because we got married right after my 21st birthday. So alcohol was a big one. We were in college and we just didn't see that happening in other relationships. So then it wasn't, and it didn't seem like, because at that time it's more common now for people to talk about therapists or counseling or seeking help. But when we got married, there really was no talk of that at all. So to talk about it, even with a friend, was like a no-no. And we both remember trying to talk about it with friends, and it almost couldn't even be handled. It couldn't even be caught by them because it was so unrelatable at the time for them to hear that stuff.
Yeah. You'd mentioned comparing yourselves to this fantasy or TV and movies. And, there's all these great movies, these romantic movies, but in some way, I think if you watch too much of that, it can hurt. What do you guys think?
Oh yeah, it's like I think it's a human condition to, we don't think this, we think from it, like a default, almost like an automatic default way of thinking is the fantasy. And because whatever you have, the only thing you're going to want to miss is what's missing right now for you. So when you look at that TV, you see how women are either interacted with, or men, or the fancy car and the boats, even just small little things where you watch a show about a couple and how the guy might interact with the girl. And let's say he slaps her on the butt, or maybe fondles her sexually. She kind of laughs and says, "Oh, stop it!" And everyone kind of, that was like the American Pie era. You grow up in that, and oh, that's what men kind of, they flirt by kind of like sexually flaunting with women. So a big conflict in our earlier marriage was around just sexual activity in general, and me projecting what Sierra, quote unquote, and this is the dangerous word, should be like, or how she should react when I do blank. And there was no real comparison.
No.
And so I saw you as like, you're not fun, or you're wrong, because every other girl I see allows it.
Right. And to be a young woman during that time, also learning about sexuality and intimacy and all of those things and what it could look like was really different. And I went on my own journey over here to discover that, while Zach was doing what he was doing over there. And so there were these little moments as we were growing up together. You could talk, it could be alcohol, it could be sex or intimacy, even communication. And we were learning from different things. And so in the desire to want to connect more, to learn more, we were actually learning completely separately. So we kind of kept dividing the farther and farther we went in our growth journeys. Me learning about sex over here, him learning about it over here, learning about alcohol over here, because there was nothing to really bring it together as a relationship.
Sierra, you said Zach was doing his thing over there. Zach, what were you doing over there?
It's like the guy in the corner.
I think just it was more. I think in the sex piece of it, I was more proactive. At the time, I worked for a company empowering women and teaching them about sex and sex toys and things like that, and in a really healthy way. And so I was having this really profound experience where I think, Zach, correct me if I'm wrong, because I feel like this sounds bad, but know that I'm talking to your 21-year-old self, is I think during that time you were just kind of monkey braining living.
Yes.
Like it was just, this is what you do, right? You just can you can just slap your wife on the butt and she likes it, right? I think that's what.
Or I get sex whenever I want.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And this is what happens.
If I don't, then you're not a good wife.
Right.
Yeah. I think, and what I was doing is just trying to fill. I was aimless, right? There was no, first off, and we can get into this later. There was no agreement between Sierra and I. Like there was no foundational, there was nothing to stand on in terms of our couple. And there was no agreed upon co-owned experience of what intimacy might look like. We were just, like you said, monkey braining around. So I was going to work every day, happy hour, almost every single day, drinking at least a light week would be 4 days a week. But I was probably drinking 6 days a week, sometimes 7. And that, to me, that was just normal. It's like what you did in the software world, and we were having a good time, sales life, and it was high octane. I often joked if I wasn't with Sierra, I'd probably be on alcohol and cocaine or something. But just anything to kind of like stimulate me and have a good time. So then when I remember earlier on in the marriage when obviously I wasn't really wooing Sierra, when you weren't really turned on by me. You look into like self-satisfying desire. So masturbation became like a big part of my life. I remember like it was I probably satisfied myself more than I can even, like, sometimes multiple times a day. And it got to a point where it was like what I needed to do to fill the void that what I wasn't getting. And the story I would tell myself is like, well, this is that's okay. This is what you have to do. If your wife isn't going to put out, like, my hand's fine enough. And of course it leads to porn and relying on that. And what I wasn't really awake to is what was kind of in the background of like this really a desire of kind of being seen and kind of heard and experienced, but there was no communication happening. So it's when you kind of look back, it's pretty clear there was nothing to when things got tough and when things got uncertain in regard to our specific physical needs. There was no communication happening.
And so in that story that Zach is having over here, then I'm creating one over here. And you're right. There was no like lining up of our stories when it came to intimacy, sex, and honestly just being related. And so as that was happening and you thinking you're doing a great job. I mean, when you're in those moments, I think it's easy to paint Zach as this bad guy who is just doing all these terrible things. But when you're in those moments, you really are self-serving. You think, this is how I'm going to get by. This is actually how I'm going to survive my marriage. And you really start to believe that. And so for me, how was I going to survive my marriage? I couldn't get close to this man. It was incredibly hard to even want to be near him physically.
It's hard to have sex with somebody that reeks of alcohol.
So that too. And so for me, it was, well, how am I going to find that feeling of feeling wanted or feeling desired? And so for me, what that looked like was, well, I'm going to go flirt with other people, and I bet I could get somebody to have sex with me. And sure as heck, I was able to do that. And so as I started to kind of entertain that and go, well, gosh, I can actually feel a lot of desire over here. Someone could actually want me and show me that they want me and actually respect what I'm doing and what I'm saying and have these deep conversations and this and that. That's how I was surviving my marriage. And so in my eyes, and if you were to ask me during that time, I would have painted myself like a victim, and that story would have looked really good. I mean, it would have looked like a really good story.
Yeah.
You can also hear it and go, gosh, what a witch, how could she possibly do that? But you have to realize, I think, that when you pass a point in your relationship where you're no longer being related, you're really surviving. And that is kind of what started, I think, to happen in our relationship. Now, when we got married, we were very fortunate to join a community right away of other couples who talked about problems on a weekly, quarterly basis.
Wise.
And we were very fortunate that one couple we were coaching with called something out. They said, we don't know what's going on. Something's going on. And you guys need to talk about it. And it wasn't that, they're not counselors or therapists or anything like that. And quite frankly, that's not what we needed at the time. But there were some things going unsaid that we had to start kind of taking a peek at. And that's when we started to, I was ready to hit the road. I was ready to get a divorce. Whereas Zach refused. He was like, no, we're going to do whatever it takes. And that was a big turning point. And I think when we started to get really...
Were you looking for that? Like, I didn't get that impression. Maybe you were, but I didn't get...
For what?
I didn't get that impression at the time that you were like... Because you often hear, like, I just wanted you to see that you cared. And, like, because I kind of, like, that wasn't an option. Like, I would have literally... We joke, like, I would have been stage 5 cleaner. I would not have let you gotten more. But were you looking for that type of conviction? Or, like, what...
You did that type of conviction.
Yeah, but what allowed...
You lived that type of conviction.
I lived it. So I get curious about that sometimes.
Yeah.
I'm like, what if you...
You lived that type of conviction. It literally was like a light bulb went off. And he went, oh my goodness. And she's going to really walk out the door. And I was. I had money set aside. I had a girlfriend ready to take me and my son. And like, we're ready. I mean, I was ready to go.
Yeah, you were serious.
I was not. I was ready to go. And this newfound commitment, it was whatever he saw in what they had said, right, reflected back to us. So something's going on. We don't know what it is, but you can't hide anymore. And I think that was a big aha of, for all that time, we had been able to hide a lot of these problems from our friends and family.
And speaking of hiding the problems, was there any more infidelity?
No. After...
It was, I don't know if you call it like a season. It was, I don't know how long of a window it was.
There was only a couple instances.
Yes. Yeah, it wasn't. There was no affair. It was more, I guess, lustful actions.
And was this on both for
No,
both
just
of you?
mine.
Okay.
I mean,
Just mine.
well, so yes and no. Just hers physically, but I was definitely. I mean, I definitely was looking. I was definitely lustful and cheating on Sierra, physically. Sorry, emotionally and mentally.
Mine was physical.
Yeah. So I looked at women very lustfully, either at work or anywhere else, and via porn or So I was still very much cheating on her visually and relying on other women for that.
Yeah.
Sense.
Yeah.
So you guys are disconnected. You, Zach, you used masturbation and of course porn. To what extent would you use pornography? So you said you would go sometimes 3 times a day or so.
Oh yeah, I mean your addiction kind of piece. I mean it was it was for sometimes it wasn't even about. It wasn't because I have a different relationship now or an association and meaning that I've created around sex now. And now it's much more than just physical pleasure for me now. But at the time, it sounds crazy, but I used it as a source of just entertainment sometimes.
Doesn't sound crazy at all.
And it's like there would be no reason besides something to do.
Yeah,
bored.
Yeah,
I know it feels good. It's bored. Why not?
Mm-hmm.
And at the time, when I've learned when I get stressed, rather than dealing with the stress, it's easier to just entertain myself, and that could be. And sometimes it wasn't porn. Sometimes it was excessive video games. Mm-hmm. Sometimes it was drinking.
Yep.
And it was typically video games or porn and drinking. And it's anything to take me away from dealing with something at that moment.
Right. And for me to not have to deal with all that, I would be going out with my girlfriends. I mean, we would be going out by ourselves. Some of them were single, some of them were not, so I was never putting myself in environments that were going to be supportive of dealing with anything that I had to deal with. And so it wasn't until we had a couple point something out that we hadn't seen before. And then you kind of flipped a switch. And I think it was in that switch flipping that we started to then get a little curious about, well, what is it that we could do and why hasn't anything worked? And so both of us kind of started engaging in the concept and new conversations about relationship.
Yeah,
I think.
We got really curious of kind of the why maybe behind it of like, I have this strong desire to drink or I have this strong desire to masturbate and watch porn. It wasn't always it was specifically porn and masturbation. Sometimes porn was just fun and it was entertaining. Mm-hmm. At the same time, getting curious on, was there like a fear? Was there was there a trauma? Was there a desire? Was there a story that I've gotten locked into? And a lot of times when events happen in your childhood, because I've dealt with molestation in my past, and so having that there's this story, and I don't relate to it as a trauma. I relate to it as a story of like being like pursued, maybe in a creepy way, but it changes your relationship and the story you tell yourself with what this activity means.
Absolutely.
And therefore, how you get connectedness is physical pleasure.
Right. And there was no conversation
Correct.
about that for quite some time until we started to uncover some more stuff in our relationship, where then a lot of things started to make sense once we kind of engaged in that work a little bit more.
Sierra, did you know that he had been molested?
No. So I would say we were probably a good 2 years maybe into doing the work that we do now, where there were certain things that we both had and said, oh goodness, we need to talk about these. And so that was, I don't know, we probably started talking about that about 10 years ago.
Yeah, it is often Chamberlain. We were in our we moved. We were in a larger house. We since downsized. We were sitting in our bedroom after a workshop that we took. I think we had like a 3-year-old son and like a 1-year-old daughter, or maybe older, 4-year-old son. But we had very young kids in the crib still. And we went to this workshop, and it was our second time taking it. And this is the work we lead now. And there was an opportunity to share withholds. And it's very scary because you have to give a lot of grace and space to your partner. And we opted to not share it the first time, and we didn't share it in the workshop. We
just made the request.
We made the request. Can I wait? I have something to tell you, and I'm scared to tell you. I'm worried that if I tell you, it'll change everything. Mm-hmm. And that allowed for a space of grace. And then that's when essentially she found out, and we both found out.
Yeah.
So I shared with her things that have happened to me and I've done in my past, and then what she has done in her past.
Right. I had shared about
infidelity
and all of these things.
She actually got away scot-free with it, if that makes sense. Like I could have never known.
Oh, I didn't. Okay. I did not get away scot-free. I was suffering so incredibly hard in my health, in my mental health, by keeping all of that in. And so while my story may have gotten away scot-free, my body, my mental health, my state of motherhood and mothering was all impacted by keeping in these secrets, really.
So, Sierra, did you have anything like the molestation happen to you as well? Or?
I had one incident when I was 12 or 13 years old, and it actually wasn't until recently. And I think that's quite common for women, right? When you start talking about it as an adult and you realize, oh my goodness, all of us were molested when we were in middle school.
Jeez.
What the heck? And I don't say all of us lightly, but I will say quite a few. And it was in one of those conversations where we all realized, gosh, that was terrible. And no one knew better. And when I say no one knew better, I mean, with Zach's story and with mine, there is a level of communicating with kids that we have now that I'm so grateful for, because we just didn't have that growing up. It was very different. It was a very different conversation. And so we got to talk about those things. And I don't feel, and I don't want to speak for you, but I don't think that either of us feel trapped or married to that story or that it impacts us. Like, they're very much released. Like, we can talk about them and even joke about them. And they don't have a lot of hold on us anymore, if that makes sense.
In my experience with coaching guys addicted to porn, all of them have some type of trauma, not necessarily being molested, but they all have some type of trauma. And they're all very different. Like, mine is not being molested. It was being ignored, really. Like, my parents were awesome, great. But my dad was a very logical guy, professor. And my mom would often joke while he was alive that she was a widow to books, because my dad was always in the basement in his study with a nose in a book. And so my dad didn't purposely ignore me, but I have 2 older brothers, but I was basically, I was basically ignored by my father. And so being ignored was my quote unquote trauma. Mm-hmm. And so everybody's got a trauma, and big or small, it's there. And one of the challenges that I had was that I knew I had some challenges, but I sought regular traditional help through a therapist and medication, going to 12-step meetings where you say that. Have either of you ever been to a 12-step meeting?
No.
Not been there, no.
Okay. So they have you say, I am powerless. Hi, my name is Eric. I'm a sexaholic. I'm powerless over porn. And it's been X amount of days since I've been sober. And that was my mantra, I'm powerless. I'm powerless. And that didn't work for me. So that hence the whole Powerful Eric thing. One day I just decided I'm not calling myself that anymore. And That was they, that pitiful, powerless, porn-addicted Eric died, and powerful Eric was born. So I appreciate you sharing those traumas, and sounds like you've been able to work through them and are in a good place now.
Well, yeah, and I think what allowed us to work through it, though, is seeing differently. Once we realized
there's a new view.
And I think once we realized all of our actions are determined by how we view something, and a part of how we view something is found inside the story we tell about a happening. There's a happening, and then there's a meaning behind the happening. And that's where I think I love what you said, is that's where a lot of power is once you realize that you are a story, and how you tell that story can create infinite possibilities. And it becomes a profound way to live when you see the choice inside of that.
Right. And rather than using the narrative of, well, if you had my story, you would be doing things differently, and using that as like a wedge in between you, we really started to see that as, you're right, actually. And every single opportunity where I have said, you've been wrong, I would have done the exact same thing with the life that I had lived up until that point if I was in your shoes. And there was something that had happened there that just kind of, I think, changed the trajectory of everything.
Yes. And and without getting too far ahead, we definitely are happy to share some of the insights that really allowed us to explore that. But it was, it doesn't mean that you, there's a lot of ordinary, what we call upsets and disappointments and challenges, including porn addiction, sex addiction, infidelity. To the average, maybe to our culture or society, it might sound
like deal breakers.
It might sound like deal breakers, and it even might sound like an understatement to say it's ordinary, but it is ordinary.
Yeah,
it is ordinary.
So before we end here, you guys are going to be on the next podcast as well, sharing your insights on how you guys turn things around and things like that. But before we get to that, you had mentioned some of the things that you tried that didn't work. What were some of the things that really didn't help or didn't work for you guys? Like for me, it was going to the 12-step meetings, and I actually got worse going to those meetings because I found new ways to act out. I'm like, oh, there's a website for that? Oh, you can do that? So I actually got much worse. Anything like that for you guys that when you tried to?
That's actually a really good question. I always laugh because Zach's therapist told him to stop coming. Or something. I always think, or, you don't need this. I don't know why you're here. It's something to that effect. And a lot of the things that we tried, because keep in mind, when we were going through this, we seemed and felt like we were the only ones because we were the first ones married. So a lot of what we tapped into were books and tips and tricks, because if you go on Amazon right now, you'll get 1 million hits on how to fix your relationship.
Yeah.
And ones that I think have a good intention but can be very harmful are ones like the 5 love languages. I know that's very popular. It is by book cover, by tips. It's great. It's great information. And I think that's where we noticed, and I use that one just because it's a very popular one.
Yeah, very.
A lot of people know. However, when you read these books, you have to realize that you're reading them as information. You're not actually being guided or experiencing anything for yourself. And it kind of talks about relationships as if everyone has the same story. And if you just do X, Y, and Z or this each day, you will be fine. And it kind of plays into that fantasy. They're almost maybe even worse, but just as bad as movies or films. And so that's kind of what we started to notice was that trend in a lot of those types of books.
Yeah. And, I am a self-development addict. I love all those books, seminars, all that stuff. I love that. But I totally agree. And one challenge that I've found is that they call it self-help. Like self, like I'm going to read this book. I'm going to help myself. But what you mentioned, Sierra, is that there's no one there to guide you or help you. So
Right.
speaking of guiding and helping you, on the next episode, they're going to share some of the things that did work, that did help. So we're going to break right here. They'll be back, and we look forward to having back Zack and Sierra. Thanks, Zack. Thanks,
Good.
Sierra.
Thank you.
Join Powerful Eric's free Facebook group, Endeavor to Quit, and take control of your life. Learn more at powerfuleric.com.